to take a life in order to protect the darkest secret of your own. Agatha Marple, a woman who had never truly known herself, was about to expose a truth that would unravel everything. But as she brought the truth to light, she would be forced to confront the consequences of her decisions, decisions that could cost more than just her peace of mind. And as one lie fell, another truth emerged, something far more dangerous, something that would reveal the real heart of the story. Today, if Agatha Marple found the missing piece of her fate, she would understand that sometimes the most perilous battle you fight is the one where you must push everyone, including your closest allies, out of your way. In the solemn majesty of the High Court, morning sunlight slanted through towering arched windows, painting streaks of muted gold across marble floors that echoed faintly beneath the shuffle of impatient feet, the weight of justice heavy in the very air. A place where truth and deceit often wore the same tailored suit. Each beam of light illuminated not just the grandeur of the chamber, the intricately carved oak panels, the dust motes dancing like silent whispers, but also the expressions of the gathered crowd, curious, judgmental, expectant. A suffocating stillness gripped the courtroom, broken only by the prosecutor's voice, clear, cutting, and precise, each syllable laced with conviction as he moved like a conductor before an invisible orchestra, orchestrating the downfall of the man seated at the defense table. Edward Copeland, a modest bookkeeper with thinning hair and shoulders hunched by invisible burdens, sat as if slowly being erased. His hands trembled slightly as they clutched his papers, the paper's edges crumpling beneath the pressure of silent panic, while a thin sheen of sweat trickled past his temples, betraying the facade of stoicism he fought to maintain. Around him, the marble columns and gilded chandeliers seemed to mock his predicament, their elegance a cruel contrast to his unraveling fate. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," the prosecutor began, his voice resonating with practiced gravity. "The story is not one of complexity, but of cold arithmetic. The evidence points clearly, unmistakably. Mr. Copeland was the final individual with access to the missing funds. His name appears on the withdrawal slips. What further shadow is needed to darken this truth?" A few benches behind the defense, a quiet woman with silver-threaded hair calmly adjusted her wire-rimmed spectacles and resumed her knitting, her movements unhurried, seemingly oblivious to the storm around her. But those who knew Agatha Marple, however few, would understand that beneath her composed exterior churned the cold, sharp mind of a woman who never wandered without reason. Her pale eyes, keen as a winter dawn, scanned every twitch of the prosecutor's hand, every flicker across the jury's faces, absorbing the silent ballet of unease playing out across the courtroom. And just when the walls of certainty seemed to close in around Edward Copeland, a small cough, frail, nervous, sliced through the air. A man stood from the gallery, average in height, swallowed in a brown wool coat that hung like a borrowed identity, his lined face flushed with purpose. "Your Honor," he called out, his voice unsteady but resolute. I need to speak." A gasp rippled through the room, a collective breath held mid-air as the judge, a man of rigid protocol with a gaze like cold steel, beneath silver eyebrows, peered down, mildly irked. "You will state your name, sir, and explain this disruption." "Michael Hewitt," the man replied, stepping forward like a man compelled by something heavier than conscience. "I can't let this go on. It wasn't him, it was me. I'm the one who did it." The shock was immediate, like an electric current surging through every soul present. Copeland blinked, wide-eyed, unable to form words as murmurs swept through the benches like wind through dry leaves. The gavel struck, demanding silence. The judge, now less stern and more intrigued, narrowed his eyes. "Do you understand what you're confessing to, Mr. Hewitt? This court does not take games lightly." Hewitt nodded, voice steadier now, but his hands gripped the witness stand like a man holding onto a ledge. "I do, Your Honor. I worked in a connected department. I had access. I I had debts, gambling debts. At first it was small, just enough to avoid the collectors, to breathe, but once I realized how easily I could move money unnoticed, I fell deeper. It wasn't supposed to go this far. He began laying out details with unnerving precision, the timing of the thefts, the quirks of the office safe, and anomalies in financial reports that no outsider could know. His confession was hypnotic, each word delivered with the sincerity of a man laying bare his sins. And yet at the back, Agatha Marple paused her knitting mid-stitch, her fingers freezing as her eyes narrowed behind the glass. Something was off, his tone, too even. His cadence, too refined. Every detail, just enough to sound irrefutable, but never quite implicating anyone else, or suggesting a wider conspiracy. It was a story wrapped in remorse, but polished like a speech. Agatha leaned slightly forward, feeling a ripple beneath the surface. She had seen guilt. She had seen fear. But this was something else. It wasn't redemption she saw in Hewitt's eyes. It was control, and the mystery that had just unfolded was far from solved. The courtroom remained thick with tension long after the judge's gavel had fallen, the sound still reverberating against the polished wood and high, vaulted ceilings, as if unwilling to fade. A heavy stillness settled over the room, the kind that makes even the faintest breath sound loud. Michael Hewitt, standing in the witness box, exhaled slowly, his lips parting to speak the words that would shift the entire course of the trial. Charges were filed. I was afraid, he murmured, almost as if confessing to himself more than to the room. His voice, low and even, carried the strange weight of rehearsed guilt, not the sharp, jagged weight of genuine remorse. He spoke as though the confession were a necessary part of a greater scheme, and as if he believed it might somehow absolve him of all that had led to this point. His next words, laced with a quiet finality, had the court hanging on each syllable. I thought, maybe if I stayed quiet, they wouldn't find out it was me. But seeing an innocent man about to be sentenced, I couldn't live with myself. The courtroom fell silent, the air was thick with disbelief, and for a moment it felt like the entire room was holding its collective breath. Agatha Marple, however, did not react as the others did. Her gaze, cool and calculating, remained fixed on Hewitt, as though she were trying to read him like a book whose pages were too carefully guarded. Unlike the others, who might have seen a man breaking down in guilt, she saw something different, something she had learned to recognize over the years. There was no crack in his demeanor, no trace of true emotional turmoil in his expression. His confession, for all its weight, felt oddly rehearsed, as if it had been practiced, honed, and polished for the very moment it was delivered. This wasn't the confession of a desperate man seeking redemption. This was the act of a man playing a part, a man trying to manipulate the narrative. She felt an unfamiliar chill crawl down her spine, the kind that came not from the cold of the courtroom, but from the instinctive recognition that something was deeply off. When the judge called for a recess, the air was thick with unspoken thoughts. Judge Wyndham, his expression unreadable, tapped his gavel again, the sharp sound slicing through the murmur of the room. "We'll recess until this afternoon," he declared, his tone unyielding, betraying none of the shock or confusion that had taken root among the witnesses and the spectators. "This court is adjourned." As the gallery exhaled as one, a soft buzz of whispers filled the space like a hum of electric anticipation. Yet Agatha remained seated, her knitting neatly stowed in her bag, her fingers resting lightly on its handle. Her posture was poised and deliberate, giving no sign of the swirling thoughts racing through her mind. The others rose and moved with the usual clamor of the disbanding court, their movements hurried, their voices rising in a cacophony of relief, confusion and shock. But Agatha remained unmoving, her grey eyes sharp, missing nothing. Her gaze swept over the scene, absorbing each fleeting moment like a careful observer of a complicated puzzle. She noted Edward Copeland, the embattled bookkeeper whose eyes were bloodshot, whose every movement seemed weighted with the burden of a life unraveling. He met her gaze for a brief instant, the flicker of hope in his eyes so fragile it almost broke her heart. But she did not respond, did not offer any reassurance, for she was already moving past him, her mind already piecing together the puzzle that had just begun to take shape. Her next glance fell upon Clara Holloway, the defense attorney whose posture was stiff with frustration, her jaw clenched as if she were holding back an avalanche of emotions. The lines of her face were sharp, her brow furrowed deeply, but there was something else in her eyes, a subtle flicker of doubt that Agatha had noticed before anyone else. "Miss Morell," Clara said, her voice a low whisper that seemed to draw Agatha closer, he confessed. "Right there, in front of everyone. What do you make of it?" Agatha's lips curved just slightly, though her expression remained cool and measured. "Confessions," she said, her voice light, almost airy, "are such curious things. They tell you so much, and yet so little." She allowed the words to hang in the air, thick with meaning, before turning on her heel. Clara, clearly struggling to grasp the depth of the answer, hesitated, her brow furrowing deeper, but Agatha didn't elaborate. She wasn't one to lay all her cards on the table. As she walked toward the door, her eyes swept over Hood again, noting how he seemed to blend so seamlessly with his surroundings now. There was no longer the nervous, hunted energy of a man about to face the consequences of his actions. Instead, he stood with a strange, unnerving calm, speaking to the court officer in a manner so controlled, so perfectly poised, that it set Agatha's nerves on edge. His tone was measured, his gestures deliberate, and his words seemed to float just high enough above the crowd to ensure they were overheard, but without ever seeming too conspicuous. Agatha paused for a moment, her gaze narrowing as she studied him, her mind racing with the unsettling thought that this confession, this dramatic outpouring of guilt, was nothing more than an opening act. He was playing his role too well. "He plays his part well," she muttered under her breath, her words barely audible, but cutting through the noise of the courtroom like a whisper in the dark. The pieces were falling into place in her mind, but there was still something she couldn't quite grasp, something in Hut's demeanor, his careful speech, that didn't quite add up. The confession was too perfect, too convenient, and she was certain this was just the beginning of a far more twisted game. The corridor echoed with the dissonant clatter of voices, a cacophony that reverberated off the cold, polished floors and high, arching ceilings. Agatha moved with deliberate grace to one side, her heels tapping softly against the stone, as she withdrew a small leather-bound notebook from her bag. A pencil in hand, she leaned against the cool marble wall, her movements measured, almost deliberate, as her sharp gaze swept across the room. She scribbled a few terse lines, her hand moving quickly, but with a steady precision, the lead tracing words that seemed to surface effortlessly from her mind. Calm, calculated, polished. Not guilt, performance. The words seemed to form their own quiet puzzle, one she was intent on solving. She paused briefly, the notebook resting in her hands as she closed it, her lips pressed in a thin line of contemplation. The confession, uttered with such crisp theatricality, had an eerie air of finality. It lacked the raw, unrefined quality of genuine remorse. No, this was a performance, one that had been rehearsed meticulously. But why now? Why him? The questions gnawed at her as she scanned the room, her mind working rapidly to piece together the fractured truth. As the sun began to rise, its light spilling through the tall arched windows of the courtroom, it softened the severe shadows cast by the dark wood paneling, bathing the scene in a faint golden glow. The energy of the room shifted, the collective hum of whispers filling the air, as the audience muttered in hushed tones about Michael Hut's startling confession. Agatha, seated once again among the spectators, adjusted her gloves with casual elegance. Her eyes, ever observant, followed the movements of the jury as they filed in, their heavy steps echoing like a drumbeat of judgment. Her gaze lingered on one particular juror, a young woman near the end of the row. She was small, her hair tightly pulled back, attempting to present an air of professionalism, but there was something about her, an unease that didn't fit. Agatha noted the way her pen tapped nervously against the wooden armrest, the slight tremble in her hands as she turned pages in her notebook. Her avoidance of eye contact was telling, her posture rigid, yet her movements betrayed an inner tension. As the proceedings continued, Agatha's attention never wavered, but her peripheral vision remained fixed on the young juror. The more the trial wore on, the more pronounced the young woman's anxiety became, her small gestures betraying a deep unease. A flinch here, a slight tightening of her grip on her pen there, each subtle movement speaking volumes. Agatha filed these observations away, her mind spinning a web of possibilities. When the judge ruled in favor of the prosecution, the juror's reaction was almost imperceptible, but to Agatha, it was glaring. The twitch of her shoulder, the sharp intake of breath, it was a crack in her composure, a crack that Agatha couldn't ignore. During the break, Agatha rose from her seat with a fluid, unhurried motion, making her way casually to the stenographer's desk. The woman, a middle-aged figure with quick hands and a kind smile, was in the midst of straightening her papers when Agatha began their conversation with practiced ease. Such a fascinating case, Agatha mused lightly, peering over her glasses as if they were simply discussing the weather. The way the jury reacts is almost as interesting as the evidence itself, don't you think? The stenographer nodded, smoothing her skirt as she stood. Yes, you can tell a lot by watching them. Some of them, they look like they've already made up their minds. Agatha's smile was small, barely noticeable. Indeed, she murmured. Her gaze flicked over to the young juror. What about her? The one on the end. What's her name? The stenographer frowned slightly, as she thought. Miss Patel, I believe. Sarah Patel. She seems rather nervous, doesn't she? Agatha arched an eyebrow, her voice maintaining its usual nonchalance. Is that so? That's unusual, isn't it? The stenographer leaned in closer, glancing around before speaking softly. Well, not common, no. But I did hear that she was seen speaking to the judge's clerk, after hours. Agatha's brow furrowed ever so slightly, her eyes narrowing. Interesting, she murmured, as the seeds of doubt took root. Isn't it? The stenographer's voice trailed off as she glanced around, clearly uneasy, and Agatha was left with her thoughts, her mind now racing with the implications of this new information. There was something more to this, something hidden beneath the surface, and Agatha was beginning to understand just how carefully this case had been stitched together. Agatha's gaze followed Sarah Patel with an intensity that barely registered to the others around her. Clarification, she murmured softly to herself, her voice barely more than a breath. Very interesting. The trial resumed, but Agatha's mind was already far beyond the courtroom, moving faster than the proceedings themselves. She studied Sarah's every movement, the subtle twitches, the nervous glance toward the judge, the way her pen was held with an almost desperate grip, knuckles whitened. There was something deliberate about her unease, as though she were desperately trying to conceal a secret that refused to stay buried. Agatha's eyes remained calm, her hands folded neatly in her lap, but inside her mind, the puzzle was rapidly taking shape. The pieces, each flicker of anxiety, each momentary hesitation, were beginning to align in a pattern she couldn't yet decipher, but sensed was important. The courtroom itself seemed to hum with a quiet tension, the voices of the lawyers and the rustling of papers filling the silence, but to Agatha, the air felt thick with something else. There was an unspoken thread running beneath the surface, and Agatha Marple, ever so deliberate, intended to pull it loose. As the trial drew to a close, the air in the courthouse grew heavier with quiet whispers and the shuffle of feet. The marble corridors, vast and echoing, seemed both magnificent and foreboding, each step resonating like a faint warning. The stained glass windows cast fractured hues of amber and to the polished floor, their colors muted yet strangely warm in contrast to the coldness of the stone. Agatha walked through the space with her usual poise, her gloved hands clasped lightly in front of her, appearing to be lost in thought, but her mind was sharply attuned to every detail of the days of. Her sharp eyes catalogued each passing gesture, each subtle shift of expression that might provide a clue, a break in the pattern. As she moved down the hall, her attention was drawn once again to Sarah Patel. The young juror's hurried steps caught her eye, nervous, too hurried, too uneven. Sarah fumbled with a small notebook and a bundle of papers, her movements erratic, a stark contrast to the tense, controlled demeanor she had kept during the trial. Agatha slowed her pace, watching carefully as Sarah's eyes darted nervously down the corridor. Then, without warning, the notebook slipped from Sarah's grasp, the pages fluttering open as it fell to the ground with a quiet thud. Agatha remained still for just a moment, taking in the sight, then moved with silent precision toward the fallen item. Sarah paused for a heartbeat, then hastily gathered her papers and walked away, not sparing a glance at the notebook now lying open on the floor. There was something in her retreat, a desperation that Agatha couldn't ignore. Kneeling gracefully, Agatha picked up the notebook, its pages fluttering as she lifted it. It opened to a hastily scrawled note, its ink almost blotched with urgency. "You promised me this would go unnoticed." Agatha's eyes lingered on the words for a moment longer than necessary, her expression neutral, but her thoughts racing. A promise broken, a hidden agreement, the cryptic words swirled in her mind as she tucked the notebook under her arm, her steps quickening slightly as she moved forward. A shift in her, the calm, calculated observer was now fully engaged in something far deeper. The quickness of Sarah's retreat, the failure to retrieve the notebook, the panic in her every movement, it didn't align with the young woman Agatha had been observing all this time. Sarah's nervousness had always been there, but this was different. Agatha's thoughts raced as she reached the end of the hall, pausing for only a moment to adjust her spectacles and tap her gloved fingers lightly against the notebook's cover. The words, "You promised me this would go unnoticed," echoed in her mind like a whispered challenge, a promise broken. Whom, and to what end? Agatha's eyes glinted with a quiet understanding, slipping the notebook into her handbag with deliberate slowness. She continued her walk, unhurried, as the world around her continued on in its oblivious pace. But in her mind, the pieces were finally coming together, and she was closer than ever to unraveling the truth hidden beneath the surface. The courtroom, as always, hummed with the muted chatter of barristers and clerks meticulously preparing for the day's proceedings, their voices merging into a constant low murmur that seemed to hang in the air like a distant storm. Above it all, a massive brass chandelier hung like a silent sentinel, casting a warm golden glow over the polished wood paneling and the rows of ornate pews, each one meticulously carved with intricate patterns. Despite the serene and polished exterior, the atmosphere was thick with unspoken tension. Mr. Copeland, the defendant, sat motionless at the defense table, his posture rigid and unyielding. His hands were folded tightly in front of him, palms pressed together as though the simple act of holding them still might somehow keep the unraveling world at bay. His face was impassive, but his eyes, shifting beneath heavy lids, betrayed a subtle restlessness, an awareness that the very air around him seemed charged with uncertainty. Clara Holloway, his defense lawyer, stood up slowly, her movements deliberate and composed. Her face, though carefully neutral, bore a slight tension at the corners of her mouth as she addressed the bench, her voice carrying a clear note of restrained irritation, as though something were gnawing at her patience. "Your Honor, before we proceed, I must bring a matter of utmost importance to the court's attention. A critical piece of evidence in my client's defense has vanished from the record." The words hung in the air like a stone dropped into a still pond, ripples of disbelief spreading across the room. The judge, his face already a mask of authority, stiffened. "Vanished," he repeated slowly, as though the word itself carried a weight too heavy to bear. His tone dropped lower, deepening into an almost menacing calm. "Are you certain of this?" Clara's eyes narrowed sharply, her green gaze now icy with determination. "Yes, Your Honor, it was duly logged and submitted evidence. We verified it was securely stored in the clerk's office just days ago, and now it has disappeared without a trace." The room collectively inhaled as murmurs swelled throughout the gallery, and even the prosecutor, whose relaxed posture had once exuded confidence, now straightened, his expression faltering ever so slightly. The judge's gavel slammed down with authority, the sharp sound cutting through the growing tension. "This is a very serious accusation, Miss Holloway," he said, his voice unyielding. "I expect a full investigation into the matter immediately, but until the ledger is recovered, we will proceed with the evidence we have on hand." He leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing into slits, betraying the faintest flicker of unease that passed through him like a shadow. Agatha Marple, seated near the back of the courtroom, had been quietly observing the events unfold. As Clara spoke, her hands gloved and poised had rested delicately in her lap. She had allowed her mind to drift, noting every subtle movement, every twitch, every change in the air. Her gaze flicked briefly from Clara to the clerk's desk, then to the judge, and back to the defense table, her sharp eyes catching the smallest nuances. She observed the jurors shifting uncomfortably in their seats, their eyes flicking nervously to one another, their hands tightening around the edges of their notes. Even the prosecutor, who had until now worn a mask of easy confidence, seemed slightly off balance by this unexpected turn of events. Agatha's thoughts, however, remained calm and focused. She had seen the ledger in the clerk's office on a previous occasion, its weighty binding unmistakable, the worn gold lettering along its spine almost glowing under the flickering lights of the office. If it was truly gone, someone had made sure of it, and if someone had ensured it was gone, then it had to be for a very specific reason. It had to contain something, something inconvenient, something that could change everything. As the morning session drew to a close, and the courtroom began to empty for lunch, Agatha excused herself from her usual companions, slipping quietly out of the room and into the quieter, lesser-traveled corridors of the courthouse. The air here was cool, tinged with the faint musty scent of old files, leather-bound books, and varnished wood, and the weight of time seemed to settle over these forgotten corners of the building. Agatha's footsteps were soft on the marble floors, the echoes of the courthouse seeming to fade as she approached a small unassuming door at the end of the hall. The brass handle was dull, its once shiny surface worn smooth from years of use, but Agatha's touch was light as she turned it. To her surprise, the door opened without resistance, a curious oversight, considering the importance of the room she was about to enter. Inside, the archive room was cramped and filled with the scent of old paper and dust. Shelves lined the walls, stacked high with boxes, bundles of old files, and leather-bound volumes, the records carefully catalogued in years gone by. Or at least that had been the plan. Agatha's sharp eyes immediately noticed the disorder. Files that should have been in neat alphabetical order were jumbled together, their labels torn or completely missing. Some boxes had been haphazardly left on the floor, their contents spilling out in chaotic disarray. But as her gloved fingers traced the spines of the volumes, it was the subtle gap on one shelf that caught her attention. The space was just wide enough to fit the missing ledger. The absence of it was unmistakable, a deliberate void that confirmed it had been removed. She knelt slightly, peering at the empty shelf, a flicker of realization settling in her mind. It wasn't just misplaced, it had been taken. As she was about to continue her search, the sound of footsteps echoed down the narrow hall, sharp and deliberate. Agatha swiftly positioned herself near a stack of unfiled documents, feigning casual interest as she began to flip through them, her movements slow and deliberate. The door creaked open, and a nervous man stepped inside. The clerk, his thin hair combed flat against his scalp, looked up with wide, startled eyes. "Miss, what are you doing here?" His voice was high, too high, and there was a faint quiver in it, that did not go unnoticed by Agatha. She looked up, offering him a polite smile, her expression warm but her eyes sharp with the edge of calculation. "Oh, I must have wandered too far," she said with a light laugh, feigning embarrassment. "I thought this was the records room." The clerk adjusted his glasses, his hands trembling as he cleared his throat, a flicker of panic crossing his face. "You're in the wrong place, miss," he stammered, his voice thick with nervousness. Agatha could feel the tension radiating from him, the subtle shift in the air that told her there was something he was hiding, something he knew, something he didn't want her to uncover. As the clerk stepped forward, his eyes darted nervously toward the shelves, and Agatha's mind raced. The ledger was gone, and the question now was who had taken it, and why. The door to the archive room creaked softly as Agatha stepped back inside, her gaze quickly scanning the cluttered space. She had barely made her way past the shelves when the clerk appeared, his face a pale mask of tension. His voice trembled slightly as he spoke, a faint quiver in his words betraying the quiet desperation simmering beneath the surface. "This area isn't meant for public access. If you need something, you should speak with the defense counsel." Agatha's lips curved into a faint smile, her tone smooth and polite, but beneath it, there was a razor-sharp edge. "That's exactly what I'm doing, Mr. Griffin. I'm helping Miss Holloway locate a file she needed for cross-research." She let the words linger in the air, each one carefully placed to reinforce the illusion of harmlessness. "I thought I might save her a bit of time." The clerk hesitated for just a beat too long, his eyes flicking nervously to the papers clutched in his hands. Agatha noticed the faint tremor in his fingers, a subtle but telling detail. "I see," he muttered finally, his gaze darting once more toward the empty shelf where the ledger should have been. His words, however, carried an edge of uncertainty. "Well, just make sure to leave everything where you found it." Agatha inclined her head, her smile broadening, a serene mask of politeness, covering the underlying steel. "Of course, Mr. Griffin, thank you, you're ever so kind." The clerk lingered for a moment, his eyes drawn to the gap on the shelf once more, before he gave a hesitant nod and withdrew. Agatha waited until his footsteps faded into silence before her eyes snapped back to the shelf. The absence of the ledger was a glaring hole in the room's otherwise meticulous order, but there was something else, something that prickled at her senses. Nearby on the floor, a waste paper basket sat innocuously in the corner. It wasn't overflowing, but a few discarded sheets and a file folder rested within. Agatha moved quickly, her hands deftly reaching for the folder. It felt odd, too light. As she opened it, her eyes immediately caught the absence of the expected contents. The pages, the important records, were missing, leaving only a single scrap of paper, a small torn piece with a set of initials scrawled on it in precise, deliberate handwriting. The handwriting, familiar and sharp, sent a chill down her spine. She folded the scrap carefully, slipping it into her handbag as a whisper of realization settled within her. Someone was tampering with evidence, and that someone was dangerously close to the bench. Agatha stepped into the hallway, the weight of her discovery settling around her. She needed answers, and she would find them. Her thoughts turned to the judge's office, a place she had visited many times before. The room, though grand in its attempt to evoke old-world luxury, was not without its subtleties. A polished mahogany desk, heavy with the weight of legal precedent, stood at the center of the room. The atmosphere was suffocating, as though the walls themselves were closing in, the plush brocade curtains muting the faintest hum of the city outside. But it was the small, modest table by the window where Agatha preferred to do her thinking. She settled there now, the late afternoon sunlight casting warm golden hues over the paper before her. The quiet was a balm to her mind, as she began to sift through the collection of scraps she had gathered. The trial transcripts, her notes on Sarah Patel's strange behavior, the cryptic message she had found, and the slip of paper bearing the judge's initials. Each piece, though seemingly insignificant on its own, began to form a pattern in her mind, a confession that rang false, A mysterious note that promised to be overlooked, a missing ledger filed under the judge's personal initials. She let the details unfurl, weaving them together with deliberate precision. But a gap remained, an unfilled space in the story. Why all this careful orchestration? Who stood to gain from it? A fleeting thought crossed her mind, something the prosecutor had said, years before, a comment tossed off with a particular air of smugness. It was about a trial long past, one where the judge had clashed repeatedly with a particular defense attorney, an attorney who had built a reputation for defending the underdog at any cost. Agatha's brow furrowed as she recalled the words, the subtle edge in the prosecutor's voice. He had to retire after that, didn't he? The prosecutor had laughed, but there was a bitterness in the laughter, a lingering venom beneath the surface. No match for our man on the bench. The words echoed in Agatha's mind, reverberating against the growing tension. The rivalry had been more than just professional, it had been personal, but could it explain the lengths to which the judge was now going? Was there something more, something deeper at play? As Agatha leaned back in her chair, the silence of the room pressing in on her, she realized that something was still missing, a more tangible of the puzzle. She would have to dig deeper, follow the threads further, and uncover the truth, no matter where it led. As evening descended, Agatha meticulously set her notes aside, slipping into a plain utilitarian coat, a stark contrast to her usual attire, signaling a shift in her approach. She was headed to a modest establishment she had overheard in passing, a tucked-away bar where whispers were currency, and secrets traded hands like precious jewels. This was not the kind of place Agatha Marple typically visited, but she understood the value of blending in when one needed to observe without being observed. The bar, nestled on a narrow street, lit only by a solitary gas lamp, exuded a quiet, smoky charm. Inside, a murmur of hushed conversation filled the air, rising and falling in rhythm with the flickering light. Agatha chose a secluded corner, her sharp gaze scanning the room as she ordered a glass, not for consumption, but as a mere prop. Her purpose was not to drink, but to listen, to catch the subtle undercurrents that rippled through the air. Before long, snippets of conversation reached her ears, furtive whispers of a land deal, of a judge's potential gain from a property transaction tied to a man named Copeland. The mention of the judge's name sent a flicker of recognition through Agatha's mind. The details were wrapped in secrecy, but the murmur of a deal that would place land into the control of a powerful bank was unmistakable. She leaned in slightly, her attention riveted as the investment firm's name was mentioned, its ties to local government and its far-reaching influence enough to raise a cold stir in her chest. The judge's name surfaced again, not with bitterness or admiration, but with the quiet resignation of someone whose influence extended much farther than anyone had anticipated. After confirming what she needed, Agatha quietly slipped away, the cool night air brushing against her skin as she made her way back to the courthouse. The streets were mostly empty, but as she entered the familiar hallways of the courthouse, she noticed a figure lingering, a court clerk, the same one she'd observed on previous occasions. He had an anxious air about him, a nervous energy that seemed to hang in the air like a cloud. Approaching him with her characteristic grace, Agatha greeted him softly, her voice an unassuming thread amidst the silence. "Good evening," she said, offering a gentle smile. "I wonder if I might have a word." The clerk looked up sharply, startled, his grip tightening on the briefcase as if it might shield him from whatever was to come. "Miss Mull, isn't it?" Agatha continued, her tone calm, almost soothing. "Yes," he stammered, clearly unsettled. "I'm not here to cause trouble," she reassured him, her voice as comforting as a lullaby. "I simply need to understand a few things." The clerk's eyes darted toward the exit, as though calculating his escape route, but Agatha's presence, so calm and unthreatening, anchored him in place. "I don't know what you mean," he muttered, his voice wavering. "I'm just doing my job, that's all." Agatha's smile remained warm and gentle. "I'm sure you are," she said, the slightest edge to her voice now, but I'm sure it must be hard working under such pressure, especially when instructions come from above. The clerk's face drained of color, his eyes widening in fear. Instructions? Agatha nodded knowingly. You see, I understand that certain communications were delivered to Miss Patel, sealed instructions, wasn't it? The words hung in the air, charged with implication. That must have been rather stressful, trying to keep everything in order. I imagine you were simply following orders. The clerk opened his mouth and closed it several times, as if words escaped him entirely. Then with a defeated sigh, he finally spoke. I didn't have a choice. The judge, he made it clear. If I didn't. His voice faltered, and his body seemed to shrink in on itself, as though the weight of his confession was more than he could bear. Agatha's hand, light as a feather, rested gently on his arm. Her voice was soft, yet there was an unspoken strength in her words. It's all right, she said, her reassurance carrying the weight of years of unspoken understanding. I just need to know the truth. And with that the truth tumbled out, a quiet confession of the judge's role in orchestrating the sealed envelopes, sent to the jurors, including one meant for Miss Patel, each envelope a thread in a web too tangled to unravel easily, yet one that Agatha now had firmly in her grasp. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to click into place, yet Agatha knew the final image was still obscured behind a veil of carefully woven deceit. Her mind worked tirelessly, piecing together the scattered fragments of evidence, the missing ledger, the odd behavior of the juror, the decoy confession, all part of a larger scheme, a web of manipulation spun by the judge, hidden beneath the guise of judicial impartiality. That evening, back in the solitude of her hotel room, Agatha spread her notes across the small table in front of her. Her fingers hovered over them for a moment, as her mind began to fill in the blanks, each connection linking to the next, painting a picture of power, ambition and betrayal. This was no longer just about the trial, it was about something far greater, an intricate game for influence, wealth and control. And at the center of it all was the judge, a man who had placed his own ambitions above the law, willing to sacrifice anything, even justice itself, to maintain his grasp on power. The realization struck Agatha with a quiet intensity, yet there was no time for self-reflection. The work was far from over, and she was no closer to uncovering the truth in its entirety. The puzzle was deeper than she had anticipated, but she was not one to shy away from the challenge. She let out a soft sigh, her hands folding neatly in her lap, before she set her mind back to the task at hand. There were more pieces to uncover, and she would find them no matter how hidden they might be. The ringing of the recess bell jolted her from her thoughts, its sharp, clear sound cutting through the tension of the courtroom. Agatha rose, her posture straight and poised, as she moved swiftly and unnoticed through the crowd, slipping into a shadowy alcove just outside the courtroom. She waited, every sense heightened as the figures moved about, their voices a dull hum of idle chatter, and then, like clockwork, Clara Holloway appeared. The defense attorney looked weary, her auburn hair slightly disheveled as though the weight of the case had worn her thin. Yet when she saw Agatha, her face softened, and she approached with a mix of desperation and hope. "Miss Marple," Clara whispered, her voice barely audible above the murmur of the crowd. "If you have something, anything that can help." Agatha raised a hand gently, her calm demeanor cutting through Clara's anxiety, like a soothing balm. "Let us not rush, my dear," Agatha said, her voice low but commanding. "This is a delicate matter, and we must approach it with care." She guided Clara into a quieter corner of the bar, where they could speak without fear of being overheard. Once settled, Agatha opened her notebook and began to lay out the evidence in front of her, each piece a crucial part of the puzzle, each revelation bringing them one step closer to the truth. She spoke with the kind of steady assurance that made Clara's nerves settle, her words methodical and precise, as though she were describing a well-thought-out plan rather than the shocking nature of the revelations. The missing ledger, the falsified instructions, the clerk's reluctant confession, all were presented with the same calm clarity, each piece of information woven together into an undeniable tapestry of corruption. Clara's expression darkened with each passing moment, her brow furrowing deeper, as she realized the enormity of what Agatha was revealing. "It's true then," she murmured, her voice trembling with both awe and anger. "The judge has been orchestrating this from the start." Agatha nodded slowly, her eyes locked onto Clara's, her gaze unwavering. "Suspicion is one thing," she replied, her tone almost absent as she continued to review the notes in front of her. "But proof is what we need, and fortunately, my dear, I believe we now have enough to make our case." Clara let out a breath, her mind racing, before tapping her pen against her notepad, the rhythmic sound breaking the silence. But then she stopped suddenly, her eyes widening in concern. "But we can't just march into court and accuse him outright," said, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "We need something official, something concrete." Agatha's smile was faint, almost imperceptible, as she folded her hands neatly in front of her. "Official?" she repeated, her voice soft yet firm. "Strategic." Clara's eyes narrowed as understanding began to dawn on her. "What are you suggesting?" Agatha's calm demeanor remained unchanged as she continued. "You will submit a motion, a late one of course, a motion not refused to hear." Clara blinked, her mind working quickly, then leaned back in her chair, her eyes searching Agatha's face for confirmation. "You mean yourself?" she asked, her voice laced with both hesitation and disbelief. Agatha's smile remained, her gaze steady as she nodded once, her voice calm but filled with quiet determination. "Indeed," she said softly, "I believe it is time for me to take the stand." Clara's hesitation was palpable, the weight of the decision pressing heavily on her. "But you're not officially involved in the case," she pointed out. "Won't they object?" Agatha chuckled softly, the sound light and reassuring. "Oh, they'll try, of course," she said with a knowing smile. "But it's all a matter of timing. If the motion is submitted after the recess, the court will have no choice but to consider it before proceeding, and once I'm under oath I can present the evidence without fear of interference." Clara's silence stretched, the gravity of the situation sinking in as she weighed the risks and the potential consequences. Finally, with a firm nod, she agreed. "All right," she said, her voice steady now, "I'll prepare the motion." Agatha stood smoothing her skirt with graceful precision, her expression serene. "Good," she said, her voice carrying a quiet authority. "And remember, my dear, timing is everything." The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as Clara's motion was reluctantly accepted by the bench. The judge, now keenly aware of the shifting tide, understood that the game had changed, and Agatha Marple, the woman who had quietly observed from the shadows, was now poised to reveal the truth that could unravel everything. Sitting rigidly behind his desk, the judge exuded an air of controlled irritation, his stern gaze sweeping the room, daring anyone to challenge the weight of his authority. His eyes flicked briefly to Agatha as she was called forward, and though his jaw tightened imperceptibly, he betrayed no other emotion. Agatha moved to the stand with graceful precision, her posture as unassuming as ever, every step calculated, as if she were merely a spectator, rather than the storm about to descend upon the courtroom. She adjusted her glasses, offering a polite nod to Clara, the defense attorney, before folding her gloved hands on the railing, her calm presence standing in stark contrast to the tense atmosphere surrounding her. The judge's gavel fell sharply, commanding the court into silence. "Miss Marple," Clara's voice rang clear and steady, the anticipation palpable. "Can you explain your findings to the court?" Agatha cleared her throat, the faintest of smiles curling at her lips. "Certainly, my dear, I have been present throughout these proceedings, quietly observing, and it occurred to me that certain details didn't align, not just in the evidence, but in the behavior of those involved," she said, her voice steady, yet carrying a quiet authority that seized the attention of the entire courtroom. The room seemed to still as Agatha continued, her gaze unwavering. "For instance, there was the juror's note," she said, retrieving a folded piece of paper from her bag. She unfolded it carefully, revealing the hastily scribbled words, "You promised me this would go unnoticed." A murmur rippled through the gallery, and the prosecutor jumped to his feet, his voice sharp with disbelief. "This is highly irregular." Agatha turned her head slowly, fixing him with a mild yet unwavering gaze. "It will be made clear in a moment, sir," she said, her tone unshaken as she resumed. The note suggested not only that this juror felt undue pressure, but also that someone had made certain assurances. Clara, her voice smooth and poised, asked, "Did you find any other evidence to support this claim, Miss Marple?" Agatha's response was swift, her confidence unbroken. "Indeed I did," she replied, producing a small scrap of paper from her bag, one that had been found in the courthouse archives. The piece, yellowed with age, bore the judge's initials. This, she continued, was all that remained in a file that once contained the ledger, the very ledger that proved the defendant's innocence. The courtroom buzzed again, this time with the realization of what Agatha was implying. The judge's hand gripped the edge of his desk, his knuckles white, but it was Agatha's next words that silenced the room once more. The missing ledger, the odd note, the behavior of the court staff, all these elements pointed to one source. The patterns were too deliberate, too convenient. Her voice, steady and measured, as she moved closer to the final revelation. "And when I traced these patterns," she paused for effect, her gaze locking with the judge's, "they led directly back to you." The courtroom erupted into shocked gasps, but Agatha's calm voice held steady above the rising noise, unyielding. The prosecutor leapt to his feet, his voice filled with